Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to History Repeating, a history talk show where we discuss crucial history that you should know. Dare we let history repeat itself? I'm your host, Meghan Hughes. Joining me is my co-host, Tim Rapone, and today we're celebrating Women's History Month.
We are. Last month was Black History Month, and just so happens this is Women's History Month, which lines up very well for our show. It's as if they knew that one day two college students would be doing a history podcast in the spring semester.
We started a little late with the Iraq War last week. Just as a heads up, next week we will not be doing our show as it is spring break. So hopefully you guys enjoy your spring break. We will be back the week after, which I think is the 24th.
Yes.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Anyway, today we are talking about milestones in women's history. This will be a general overview of women's history in the United States.
And other aspects as well.
Yes. So, to start, Women's History Month began as a local celebration in Santa Rosa, California. They began as a Women's History Week in 1978. And eventually, this was made national by former President Jimmy Carter. And then, from then on, every president designated a week until about 1995, when it was designated as a month, which is awesome, I think.
Yeah.
But we're going to go over a little bit of a
very
timeline.
Carter thing to do.
Yeah, it is. That didn't surprise me at all.
A lot of things like that start with Carter, and then somehow miraculously survived the mass extinction event of the Reagan administration. Sorry, what? Was that too much?
Yeah, I think so.
It's too late.
But in the United States, women's history has been what I would call a very slow progressing, not women's history, women's rights have progressed at a very both slow and fast pace in certain aspects.
It's one of those great hypocrisies and paradoxes of the American experiment going back to the Constitution, or no, not even that, before the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
That all men are created equal. Mm-hmm. And then ever since that was said, there were women on the sidelines asking, "What does that mean, us too?" Just like there were slaves asking, "Does that mean we're equal?" And of course, the answer was, "No, not really." But that didn't stop them, and it was long fought.
What's ironic is that in pre-United States colonial era, women could serve on juries, but they were not allowed to vote until the 20th century.
And that's something that I like to highlight when we get to my segment, is how much it is not so much a gradual incline towards equality and civil rights, more as it is a rocky up and down road.
Yes. And
a hard-fought road that needs to be maintained.
I will be mentioning a few civil court cases. Forgive us, the pollen is pretty bad this time of year. I will be mentioning a few landmark civil court cases, not as many as I would like, because there are other moments in women's history that I would like to talk about. So for just today, we're going to be talking about just a few of what I think is important landmark cases. And perhaps later this month, we might discuss further into detail court cases that really cemented women's rights. But to start off, we're going to start in 1920, because I think anything before that would be a little tedious, because we know that women in 1920 were already pretty far behind in the rights area. But 1920 was the first major marker in the United States for women's civil rights. This is when the 19th Amendment was ratified.
In 1919.
1919, which granted women the right to vote. This was during World War I, and the real promoters of this were the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Women began to join the war effort. They argued that women deserved the vote because they were patriots, caregivers, and mothers. Women's expertise in maintaining the home and family would improve politics and society, as argued by the National Women's History Museum. You can find more information about this at crusadeforthevote.org.
I remember distinctly, I don't know the exact quote, but Wilson was a strange president. Certainly by no means progressive, but ironically he was the one who passed the 19th Amendment. And I remember him saying something like, after all their help during the war, because they filled in the factory roles and stuff like that, he said they deserved it. I think that's almost kind of condescending.
He said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?"
Not as bad as I remember it being.
That was his address to the Senate in 1918.
Shocking that it got passed that early. I'd look to know more about that at some point, because I wonder how they got that passed.
Yeah.
I guess it was long, hard. I mean, the women's suffrage movement goes back to like the 1850s. So it was in the news for a while, but it came through. In the 1920s in general.
Woodrow Wilson had previously refused to endorse suffrage.
Lol.
Which I'm honestly...
That's the Wilson I know.
I'm not sure what made him change his mind.
He is such an enigma because, he also ran on the campaign of, I'm not getting involved in World War I. And then he got involved in World War I. So
that was also a very funny time.
And then he also ran on a campaign of not equal rights for African Americans, but he ran on a very progressive African American campaign to get their vote. And then as soon as he got in office, he flip flopped and said, "Never mind, I'm going to actually be extremely regressive in terms of African American rights." And then again, he flip flopped on women's rights in the other direction. He is a very confusing president.
I think it has a lot to do with possibly public opinion. I think when he thinks one way, and then this is my theory, because we obviously can't know what influenced Woodrow Wilson for sure, but I think it could be a lot of public opinion, because the combination of the NAWSA, and the National Women's Party, the NWP, protesting outside the White House was ultimately when he made his decision to promote it to the Senate.
Yeah. But I was also going to mention the 1920s were in general a very interesting moment for women's rights. Following the 19th Amendment, it kind of ushered in that a bit of a boost in morale, I guess. That's when flappers became a thing, and women were encouraged to be a bit more free-spirited. It was very controversial, of course, but even in just the clothing of the 1920s, it's more loose, more freeing from the traditional tight, stuffy, uncomfortable Victorian dress. And women started cutting their hair shorter, and they changed their makeup. And the 19th...
That was kind of an interesting, not from necessarily, a historical kind of fashion perspective, to look at how that was kind of the major change. And then from every decade thereon, women had almost not a new style, but a reinvented style.
I believe, because after World War I, you saw that kind of boost. And war, we mentioned this before, war kind of has this effect on people when the marginalized are suddenly given the chance to have a semi-equal standing with other people. It had that effect where women felt more liberated afterwards with the 19th Amendment and stuff like that. And then we see in World War II, there is a distinct movement to make sure that didn't happen again, which I'm sure you'll talk about in a minute here.
And that leads us into World War II.
Okay, perfect, right on time.
1942. This is when the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which is now the Women's Army Corps, was founded. So when the United States declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy in 1941, the only women in the military and the Army and the Navy were nurses. And this was brought about by U.S. Representative Edith North Rogers. Sorry, stumbling over my words today. Of guess where? Massachusetts.
Oh my God! We should have a soundboard effect whenever Massachusetts gets mentioned, or New England in general. Have we mentioned on the podcast that I'm a blue-hearted, blue-blooded Yankee? I'm a Unionist
patriot.
Yankee.
New England.
You can't
patriot.
see. I'm always wearing
You're
Union blue. I got my
Tim.
Union hat on. I got a flag of Abraham Lincoln behind us. You guys can't see it, but it's a sight to see. And JFK. Who could forget?
I don't even remember where I was. But it was Edith Norse Rogers. I don't know why I struggle over that name so much. She recognized that other countries, such as the USSR, China, and Great Britain, were allowing and drafting women to participate in war effort franchises.
Not on the front lines, but in the other aspects.
In factories, air service, air raid protection. There were some cases of combat, but that was not
again. And it's worth mentioning that World War II was, it was a total war. It was a war on scale no one had ever seen before. So a lot of men were leaving, which meant that a lot of women were needed to fill in their roles. And yeah, they did. It's interesting because I knew someone very briefly who actually served in World War II.
Wow.
On D-Day, no less. So he was on, I think, Omaha Beach. And he told me the story of how he met his wife. And he met her because she was part of that. She was one of those women working in the military. And he met her on the ski slopes in Austria after the war had ended. But they were both American.
No, yeah. That's amazing.
So that just shows the kind of that women were allowed to go to Europe and help, and not just stay at home.
And that was a big factor. And when she saw this, she introduced a bill in 1941 to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And it took a year, but a year later, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the act and established the WAAC on May 15th, 1942. And this information is from the National World War II Museum. You can find more information at National World War II. That's www.museum.org. And it's worth noting that despite facing constant discrimination, even after being permitted into the military, more than 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And this was in non-combat roles, but it paved the way for women's permanent inclusion in the U.S. military.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it was a huge moment. And then, are you going to talk about the 1950s? Am I stepping on your toes here?
No.
I want to talk about the after effect.
We skip over 1950s.
See, I keep being a Debbie Downer on this podcast because you're talking all these positive things, and I'm like, here's when it got bad, though, because I like to mention, because this sounds like we're on a nice.
The 1950s are worth mentioning, and I will talk about a lot of drawbacks in women's civil rights.
We tend to think of progress, that kind of 19th century idea of progress. Things are moving towards a better end, but that's not always true. You could very well argue that a woman living in the 1920s was in many ways more free and more equal, not on equal footing, but more equal footing than a woman living in the 1950s. It was not a
I don't
upward
disagree
battle.
with you there at all.
I think that is the general historical consensus because after World War II...
That was baby boomers. The baby boom.
Yeah. After World War II, all these men came back from the war and their jobs were taken by women. And women didn't want to leave them. They liked the independence and freedom they got. This was a similar issue that happened in World War I, and we saw what happened then. Women had a much more sort of liberation movement going on with the flapper hairstyles and their roles in the blossoming movie industry and stuff like that. So this time in World War II, we did not see the same thing happen. In World War II, things got incredibly more conservative on the women's rights front, and women were kicked out of the factories. And men took back their jobs, and suddenly we see, with the rising suburbia going on across America, people moving to suburbs, we see a national push of this American dream, this American ideal. We've seen all the propaganda pieces from the 1950s of the happy, white, middle-class American...
White picket fence. Suburbia.
Mother, father,
nuclear
son,
family,
daughter, dog... probably living in a nuclear household. That's when that happened, and it was incredibly restrictive. Women were expected to be nothing less than childbearers.
It
was called the cult of domesticity, which goes back farther than this, but it came back hard. I
didn't know it had a term.
Yeah, that's called the cult of domesticity, and it's relevant in my segment later on. We're going to see the origins of that when we get to my segment.
Which is good, because in my timeline, I rarely tap on the 1950s, but
it's a fascinating time because it was very. I mean,
sure.
This is my fault, so take this with a grain of salt. I'm recalling from the back of my brain, one of my history classes, a anecdotes from women in the 1950s, which, by the way, were often very psyched up on pills because they were so depressed, and they thought that because they lived in this strict culture of I have to want children and I have to want to be a housewife. If for some reason they felt unfulfilled being just a mother, they'd blame themselves and they'd feel really depressed over that. They say, "What's wrong with me? I'm being told this is what I want. Why am I unhappy? Am I not a good wife? Am I not a good mother?" And it would be incredibly depressive. I believe suicide rates were higher in the 50s. Someone double check me on that.
I can imagine, yeah.
But also one thing, I remember reading a story about a woman going out with a bunch of other girlfriends, like friends of other wives and stuff. Mm-hmm. They all went together as like a girls' night out to a cafe. And finally, one of them said it quite apart out loud and like, "Do you guys ever feel unfulfilled?" And they described it as a dam breaking loose. And they were like, "Yes, I feel the exact same way." And it was like in their minds, in their personal lives, it was a watershed moment of realizing it's not just me. This is restrictive. This is not fair to us.
And ideas of this domesticity cult are still very, very, very,
we
very
still
alive
see that.
today.
Those same propaganda images of the nuclear family are still in circulation today.
Yeah, it's something that I think has even been emphasized a lot more.
Definitely in the past 5-6 years.
21st century, yes. And so that's why I think Women's History Month is so important, is that we highlight not just the positive parts, but also the drawbacks, because it is worth mentioning and understanding these so that we don't repeat these situations.
And it's worth
again.
noting, someone double-checked on the suicide rates, but I know for a fact death rates from people trying to attempt abortions on themselves are incredibly high in the 1950s because there was no access to birth control and stuff like that. So it's worth noting that it's not just about equal rights. I mean, equal rights are great on their own right, but also it saves lives. Mm-hmm. It objectively putting women and any marginalized group on an equal footing with the rest of the country objectively saves lives.
There's a really great, and this is not completely historical, but also worth mentioning because I read a book last year. If you like historical fiction fantasy, which is a kind of a odd...
Historical nonfiction.
No, it's fiction. Historical...
historical... Yeah, sorry. I'm stupid.
Historical fiction fantasy. But it is a book called When Women Were Dragons. Forgive me because I forget the author's name, but it is about housewives in the 1950s, a girl growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, and having to take care of her sister, her mom having passed away, having an absent father, and sort of the challenges that she faces because of the cult of domesticity. You know, she wants to learn about these things that are considered very taboo. You know, women are rarely talked about or acknowledged, and this is historical fiction, and there is a huge fantasy element involved in it. So, of course, it is not completely accurate, but they do mention post-World War II. They talk about sexuality, spirituality, kind of the role mothers are supposed to play. It's a very, very interesting book.
Yeah.
And it's worth a read because it kind of talks about these sentiments in the 1950s, just framed in a little bit more of a fantastical way. But moving on from the 1950s, we enter the 1960s, which is the era of the civil rights movement.
Especially towards the end, 60s and 70s.
Starting in 1963, we're going to talk about the Equal Pay Act, which was passed by former President John F. Kennedy. It prohibits sex-based wage discrimination at a federal level. There's not much more to be said about the actual passing of this bill, but it should be noted that despite the Equal Pay Act, many women across the United States still experience wage discrimination.
Passing a law and enforcing a law are two very different things, especially when half the government doesn't want to enforce a law.
That's true.
So...
I believe
laws are only the first step.
Yeah, I believe the current rate is 3/4 of a whole that a woman makes for every dollar that a man makes. I could be wrong.
About 75 cents.
75 cents to a dollar. Yeah. And of course, this isn't true in all situations. I don't experience it, which I'm very fortunate for. But it should be noted that this is still a very common issue, and more work needs to be done in this area. And unfortunately, that was all I included for the 1960s, but there are a lot more.
There was the sexual liberation, sexual freedom.
There's a lot more worth mentioning.
It's when women started throwing off the shackles, burning their bras, working for
there were a lot
birth
of different,
control, no-fault divorce. Was that before? I think no-fault divorce was actually the 40s. I don't know.
Really?
I don't know. I could be wrong on that one. But yeah,
there was our research. And that information is from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which you can find at eeoc.gov. In the 1970s, this is continuing the civil rights movement, Reed versus Reed is a court case that I wanted to mention because I feel like it is not really well known.
Yeah, and because you said you didn't do too much on the 60s, I feel like everything you're about to say in the 70s, that was hard fought during the 60s.
True.
Like Roe v. Wade, that was after 10 years of civil rights movements in the 1960s. So these are the 70s are kind of like the results.
Yeah.
The results after the hard fought protests and battles that had taken place in the previous decade.
So the story behind Reed v. Reed, Richard Lynn Reed, a minor, died interstate in Ada County, Idaho, in 1967. His adoptive parents, who were divorced before his death, filed a petition in the probate court of Ada County. Forgive me. This is because before 1971, the administrator of a decedent's estate was based solely on sex. So if you had a son or a relative or someone who died, even if you were the next of kin, it would go to whoever was male. So say the mom and the father lost their son, it would go to the father.
That. I forgot the name for it. I should know because it's I should know it because I love medieval history. But it's the rule that you for eldest son. Literally a medieval rule.
Yeah.
It goes back to Germanic tribes.
It took this long to get here.
Yeah.
But Sally Reed, his mother, filed a petition in the probate court of Ada County. The code gives preference to men over women when persons of the same entitlement class apply for appointment as administrator of a decedent's estate. It was decided that this was discrimination and prohibited and in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and therefore ruled that discrimination based on gender is not constitutional in the case of naming the administrator of an estate.
Yeah, which has big implications.
We're having a visitor right now. There's a drone outside the studio window.
You're humming. That's what that is. You probably shouldn't be looking at it, though. They probably want natural footage. So, anyways, what's next? What's next on the list?
Of a surprise. Next, we continue in the 1970s with probably the most famous court case, in my opinion, Roe v. Wade. And I'm assuming most of our listeners know at least or have heard of this case. This was the Supreme Court case that gave women the right to privacy in terminating a pregnancy. In other words, made abortions legal and prevented states from banning abortions and removed pre-existing criminal abortion bans. And this information is from the Center for Reproductive Rights, which you can find at reproductiverights.org. So the story behind this is that in 1973, the Supreme Court struck down Texas's criminal ban on abortion and held that the right to abortion is a fundamental right. And this was in a 7-2 vote, along with decisions relating to marriage, contraception, education, and family relationships. The decision about whether to continue or end pregnancy is fundamental to personal liberty. In doing so, the court recognized the great detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice, including the health and economic risks of being forced to continue a pregnancy.
A lot of pregnancies are can end in death for the mother and the child.
Especially in this time, too.
So again, we're talking about laws like this saving lives. We have already seen in recent states that have overturned the authority of Roe v. Wade because it was never legalized. It was just a Supreme Court ruling, which means that it is
a guidance.
Kind of a guidance more than it is, in essence, a law. But since it was overturned by the recent Supreme Court ruling, we have seen women die from this, and we've seen children forced to go into motherhood at the age of 14.
A real issue with this is that it does not account for ectopic pregnancies, stillbirths, or any other medical reasons that a pregnancy should be terminated. And and this is in the case for early stage and late stage abortions. There are some states where it is still legal and you can legally receive an abortion, but as of right now, in many cases, abortion is considered illegal. Yeah.
You know where it's legal still?
Where?
The great state of Massachusetts. Anyways, sorry, is that too much bias? Sorry, guys.
No, it's okay. You're allowed to be a little biased on the
if I'm from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Number 1 in education. Next one.
We'll call it the New England Patriots bias.
We're going to get a soundbite for this, guys. Stand tuned. Stand by.
And speaking of pregnancy, in 1978, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act is passed. And I'm going to read this all, so forgive me because I'm going to read the amendment itself. But in 1978, Congress passed the Amendment Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit sex discrimination on the basis of pregnancy pertaining to employment. The new subsection reads, the terms because of sex or on the basis of sex include, but are not limited to, because of or on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions, and women affected by pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions shall be treated the same for all employment-related purposes, including receipt of benefits under fringe benefit programs as other persons not so affected but similar in their ability or inability to work, and nothing in Section 703 of this title shall be interpreted to permit otherwise. It's also noted that this does not require an employer to pay for health insurance benefits for abortion, except wherein the life of the mother would be endangered if the fetus were carried to term, or except where medical complications have arisen from an abortion. So this was essentially just preventing employers from firing women on the basis of pregnancy or refusing to pay, not hiring them, or refusing to pay medical bills under insurance.
A major win for labor rights in general.
Yes. And this was a very, very common thing. And growing up, I had no idea.
If you're a CEO, you're thinking it's not profitable to have someone not in work for about 4-8 months. So
nowadays,
you need these laws to protect the rights of a worker, because that's not fair to the worker. All the company's thinking about is their bottom line and their profit, and that in turn leads to an unequal balance in more men in jobs than women, because they don't want to hire a woman if she's pregnant or going to get pregnant.
There were a lot of unintended benefits to this, which
and that's
is
half
amazing.
The workforce. Women are half the population. That's half the workforce that are being denied labor, which is bad in many, many ways. So not just a win for women's rights, but a win for labor rights and workers in general. And
luckily, this has been not overturned. This is still enacted today. Of course, there are workarounds, and some companies do attempt to work around.
It's a law that's not easily enforceable in many ways.
It's not something that is easy to prove. It should be mentioned, though, that also FMLA, family medical leave, is another resource for pregnant women, as well as maternity leave. The laws regarding maternity leave in the U.S. are a lot more complicated than in Europe, which I think I know for some reason more extensively about the laws regarding maternity leave in Europe. Not sure why. But I think it is. We're going to jump really far ahead, so forgive me because I did want to mention some recent history. 2016 is where we're moving to now, and this is a very big jump. But in 2016, I think everybody knows and is fully aware of this, but the first woman receives a presidential nomination by a major political party. And I am talking, of course, about Hillary Rodham Clinton. She was the chosen representative of the Democrat Party. And this information is received from the National Women's History Museum at womenshistory.org, which is where I got a lot of this information, and it is definitely worth checking out.
Yes.
So, in July of 2016, Hillary Rodham Clinton became the first woman in history to represent a major party in the United States presidential election.
Of course, this is about 30, 40 years after most other first world countries had already seen women prime ministers or other women in leading roles in their governments, but America tends to be a little late to the game on this.
And that being said, she did not win the presidential election. She won the popular vote, 48% to 46%. But she lost the Republican race to she lost the presidential race to her Republican opponent, Donald Trump, in the Electoral College, which I think most people are aware of, But it is worth mentioning that this really was the first time a woman was really considered for president.
Really close. Technically,
Very
in
close.
some countries, by their election laws, would have won, but not by our laws.
It's also worth mentioning that she is the first woman to win the Iowa Presidential Caucus, the first lady elected to the United States Senate, and the first female senator from New York, which is kind of crazy to me. She's the first female senator from New York. I feel like New York would
make sense, like, to me.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Speaking of women in presidential roles, jump to 2020, that glorious year of COVID, when Kamala Harris became the first woman vice president of the United States. I think
almost there.
Everybody
almost there.
Everybody knows about that, but yeah, not quite
there. It's going to be a bit.
Hopefully, we'll see that in the very, very, very near future.
Yeah.
When's the next election? 2028?
2028, but
just a few more years to go.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. In November of 2020, U.S. Senator Kamala Harris was elected Vice President of the United States. Not only was she the first woman to be Vice President, she was also the first woman of color, the first Black woman, and the first South Asian woman elected to this office.
That's a lot in one.
Yep. Which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And last but not least, 2022 is the most recent case of women's accomplishments that I have here. Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm not sure if anyone would recognize her by name because I often don't hear too much about the Supreme Court. But she became the first Black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court. And I got this information from OYE, which is Cornell's Legal Information Institute project. And you can find this at oyez.org. So President Joe Biden appointed her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in 2021, and then nominated her as an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2022. And she took her seat on June 30th, 2022, becoming the first Black woman to sit in the court, and now serves as the 116th Justice. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was born in Washington, D.C. on September 14th, 1970. She received a BA from Harvard Radcliffe College in 1992 and a JD from Harvard Law School in 1996. And before she served on the U.S. Supreme Court, she served in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia from 2013 to 2021.
All right.
Which is a pretty amazing timeline of history.
Again, we're
just touching the surface
We're
here,
touching the surface, but also these are all things that have to be hard maintained. Like Roe v. Wade was an achievement, and now it is being reversed.
It is reversed.
The 19th century idea of progress, always moving towards a better future, is not necessarily true.
That is one of the
These are things that you need to...
Certain things that we know on this show is that progress is not linear. And a lot of people kind of imagine it to be. So when we see progress take a turn for the worse, we think it will go that way, it will stay that way. But we have to understand that the more that we forget about this history, the more we are doomed to repeat it. We are back. We're talking about Women's History Month.
Still, it's my turn to me.
We're going to let, Tim say a few words.
I definitely know the most of this topic because I certainly am the most, you know what I mean?
Let him finish that.
Yeah, no. Anyways, I wanted to talk about something that people don't normally think about when it comes to women's history, women's rights. Once again, I'm going to be the Debbie Downer of the two of us. And that is, we're going way back for this one. We're going across the ocean. We're going to the Protestant Reformation.
Across the pond?
Yes. We're going to the Protestant Reformation in the 1520s in Europe, and that's impacts on women's rights, which is something that I was taught about a little bit in my college classes, and I thought it was utterly fascinating. Again, we think of progress generally being on this upward incline. Generally speaking, we're always moving towards a better future. And typically, the Protestant Reformation is seen as being one of those moments that was putting us further up that incline of progress. Generally, at least in the schools I was taught in, especially in Massachusetts, where you're coming from a very Puritan, very originated colony founded by Puritans, Protestant Puritans, the Protestant Reformation is seen as sort of the starting point that ultimately concluded with civil liberties and the Constitution and the founding of America. And sorry. So, the Protestant Reformation started because Martin Luther had criticism of the Catholic Church, and it spawned this big rupture from Catholicism, and it encouraged people to read the Bible on their own, to interpret the Bible. It allowed for numerous different denominations of Christianity, not just the one Catholic interpretation, but suddenly there were hundreds and then thousands of different types of Christianity that people in Western Europe could follow. And that, in a way, was very empowering. People were now encouraged to read the Bible on their own, in their own vernacular. No longer were they being preached to from priests in Latin, but now they could read it and understand it in their own way. And they were reading passages that they had not heard of before, and they were coming to their own conclusions. And again, this breakaway from the Catholic Church, generally speaking, and how it's taught, is seen as a step towards democracy, is the way that it was taught towards me. That's just my personal experience. This breakaway and this sort of what's the word I'm thinking of? Empowerment, I guess, to self-empower, to educate yourself, not just but like as a peasant, you're reading for yourself and you're learning for yourself and you're thinking for yourself. It's sort of thought independence that would eventually lead towards democracy, the founding of America. Again, a lot of people would argue that it started with the Protestant Reformation and the rise of democracies across the globe. That's the general idea. But as I'd like to point out, and as many historians are now pointing out, it wasn't always that way, especially not for women, because it was often taught that women were also beneficiaries of this independence from the Catholic Church. But that wasn't exactly true. Instead of... in many ways, people would argue that women became spiritual equals after the Protestant Reformation, that the Protestants taught that women were spiritually equal to men now. And as we'll see, that's great if you're a spiritual equal, but we're not in heaven yet. We're on earth. And on earth, they were by no means equals. And in many ways, the Protestant Reformation actually hurt women's rights and the average day of a woman living in Europe or early colonial America. Here's a quote from Michelle Arndt in her article, A Medieval Makeover, Women's Roles Before and After the Reformation. This is a quote from Martin Luther. This is what I'm looking at. Sorry, this is from Karen Stedding, What the Reformation Did and Didn't Do for Women. The word and works of God is quite clear, that women were made either to be wives or prostitutes. That is a quote from Martin Luther, the reformer, the person who broke away for the Protestant Reformation. That's not a very equal. That doesn't sound very equal. That doesn't sound very helpful towards women's rights. He went on to say that men have broad and large chests and small and narrow hips, and that they are more understanding than women, who have but small and narrow breasts and broad hips. To the end, they should remain at home, sit still, keep house, and bear and bring up children.
When was this?
1520s. So this idea that the idea for women was now that they were equals spiritually, but their role
in every other sense.
And the
of
role
word.
that Martin Luther is making for them is that they are to be wives and that they are to be servants to their husbands, as the Bible says. And again, disclaimer: if you're Christian, we are criticizing views from 500, 600 years ago. We have no issues with anyone of any religious denomination. We are.
This is more the sentiment of
historical.
The era.
I promise you, I don't think a single Christian alive today would recognize the Protestants and Puritans and Catholics of the 1500s. Those religions and those interpretations are completely
These things have evolved
different.
And changed.
A Puritan of today would not recognize the faith of today. They're two very different things. So when we're making these harsh criticisms, they're not levied against you or your personal faith. We are simply talking about these historical figures and how their interpretations, whether they meant to or not, ended up hurting other people. Women, a lot of schools were opened for women to educate them on the Bible and stuff, but they had no actual opportunities to use their education. which is another way that people would point and say that how can the Protestant Reformation be bad for women if they were opening schools for them? They're like, yes, that is definitely a pro that there were more schools for women. But in the example of John Calvin, who started Calvinism, which eventually gave way to Puritanism in England and colonial America, he ran a religious city in Geneva, a very harsh one. He opened schools for women, but they could not hold any position of office. They were they had to be wives, and that was it. And again, a lot of historians are making the new connection that really that cult of domesticity, it owes its origins to the Protestant Reformation. This is where we see for the first time, not really the first time, but in a heightened sense, the idea that women are not allowed to go out into the world and do their own thing. Their role is as a wife and as a childbearer. I have another quote from Mr. Martin Luther where he says, "Should I rock the baby, wash the diapers, make the bed, smell foul odors, watch through the night, wait upon the bawling youngster and heal its infected sores, and take care of the wife, support her by working, tend to this, tend to that, do this, do that, suffer this, suffer that, and put up with whatever additional displeasure and troubled married life brings? Should I be so imprisoned? I confess to thee that I am not worthy to rock the little babe or wash its diapers, or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother." So what he's saying here is that I don't want to do that. It is the wife's job to do all that, and it's the men's job to go off and be priests and to run government and stuff like that.
I want to add to that this was, going back to my topic, this was the sentiment and usually the narrative used to push anti-suffragist
and
propaganda.
Anti-women and women in workplaces.
Yes. This was especially true if you go back and look at political comics from the 1920s. You will see their main argument is that when women go off to vote, men will then have to become the caregivers and take care of the house and take care of the children and become the domestic servants of women, which is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly ironic to me when you see that their argument is we don't want to be treated the way we treat women, and that is why women must not be able to vote.
Yes. So we're, again, that idea that a man goes off into the world and a woman stays at home, we see that really emphasized in the Protestant Reformation. Technically, they're allowed education, but really their roles were as wives. Now, women's rights in the Middle Ages weren't really any better. Well, but they had more opportunities, is the point that Michelle Arndt makes in her article, A Medieval Makeover, because there were convents of nuns, and after the Protestant Reformations, monasteries like for monks and for nuns were closed down if there was a Protestant country. So no longer could a woman go off and be a nun. No longer could she try to make her own religious monastery. No longer could she should she choose to be her own, to not remarry or to not marry. It was now fully expected that she would be a wife and nothing more. This is a quote from Michelle Arndt. "This lit a fire under the Reformation and its doctrine. The ground underneath women's feet began to shift dramatically. The place of women in the church since the first century experienced a dramatic makeover. No longer were women leading and serving alongside men in the church. Now they were being sent home to serve not alongside but under men." And she goes on to talk about how in the Middle Ages, virginity was highly emphasized as an empowering thing, a spiritual thing for women to uphold, which is very problematic in its own way. But we see that replaced in the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther is saying that actually sexuality is normal and good, which seems like a very progressive thing to say. It seems like it would be good, but they interpret it in a very in a way that ended up actually hurting women in many ways, because that meant that their sexuality wasn't empowering themselves; it was used to service men. Priests under many Protestant denominations could take wives, but that sexuality of theirs, and that they didn't only that was in service of men, is the point that was now being made. So again, we see that sort of give and take here, and it's not a neat linear line, and it ends up creating problems that we are still experiencing today. That cult of domesticity, we see it originated here. Even
though that these sentiments seem backwards when said out loud, there is a lot of this echoed in modern discussion of women's bodies, about women's sexuality, and that's a discussion of its own to be had another time. But it is interesting how, despite the progress of this being so nonlinear and jumping from one point to another in the same exact argument. It carried over from 500 years ago to the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And with that, I want to conclude our show today and say that Women's History Month is just 1 month out of the year, but all this history is very important. And you should know that with these recent achievements, we still have a long way to go in women's civil rights. And this is something that must be emphasized. So we want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I've been your host, Meghan Hughes, and I'm joined by Tim Rapone. We want to thank you for listening to History Repeating.